ourselves in terms of course, later on, in terms of our participation in key international organizations. And here I'm thinking of individuals like Sir Sridhar Ramphal, our role within the Commonwealth. We know Guyana was very, very respected internationally at that time. So I think we were forging ahead. The biggest failure, the biggest mistake, I think that we really did not spend enough time focusing on what it was going to be a Guyanese. We didn't spend enough time focusing and forging um, what it would mean to all of us. And I think we underestimated that because we had different individuals, different groups of people coming from different countries with different histories, different races, all put together into one melting pot. I think we did not consider enough how we were going to deal with the issues of healing in some respect, because here I'm talking about a group that came out of slavery, reconciliation, even those that came under indentureship that still had severe challenges and expectations that were not met when they came to this part of the world. So I think in retrospect, the failure to deal with these issues and to forge a Guyanese culture, a Guyanese vision, who we are as a people, and what we wanted to achieve, that at least we could have agreed on maybe 4 or 5 things and not be in a constant, what appears to be a fight from, from independence right through to now. We appear to just be fighting, and it's just a matter of who is winning the fight at a particular time in our history. We consider places like Trinidad and, most importantly, Jamaica, which, despite their groups, have somehow been able to spend a little more time and create that vision of what it is to be a Jamaican that almost everybody can identify with. And we started with our music, and quite a few other things. In sports, we made our name later on with people like Clive Lloyd leading the West Indies at that time. Great stamp internationally, what it is, what a Guyanese is, where we are. But I think those would be my comments on our ability, our success, and of course our failure.
Dwayne, what, from your standpoint, our greatest success and our greatest failure?
Dr. Hines, I would like to, if I put it this way, expand a bit more on Kathy's point. And I think that she mentioned a lot of the respect that we had in the international arena and in the different international forums. But I think if we look carefully, those successes were based on our ability and the focus that we give to education, especially after 1976, where education was completely nationalized and we moved from a sort of elitist type education and made education accessible to the great masses in the society. But not only that but we also reformed had numerous curriculum reforms that were focused essentially on Guyanese content and promoting indigenous development. Also building the kind of human resource that was necessary to support Guyana's development trust. Some of those institutions are very still in existence today. You could look back at many teachers trained in college and others. But the point about it is that we had universal free education from nursery to university, and it's something that is still enshrined as a right in our constitution today. And I think that is one of our success. I mean, we had lots of success coming out of that. But I think while we've managed to had success in education, I think somewhere along the line, we missed the mark. And we missed the mark in terms of how we could have used that education in some way or the other to achieve what our objectives were after we would have gained independence, more so how we would have achieved national unity. Um, while we did much in promoting the Guyanese curriculum, if we want to put it that way, and creating the ideal Guyanese man, the ethnic problems we failed to address, and I think successive governments post-independence failed to address the ethnic problem. And we continue to be a divided nation, and we continue to be essentially a fractured society where we compete. And I think the problem have been made even worse by the fact that we failed to address the issues of governance, especially the Westminster model, where we have winner take all politics. Just look and see how our parliament actually functions. If you're the governing party, it's because you control the parliament. You control that 51%, and the 49% basically is powerless. They have no say. So we failed to address that problem, and it is even more pronounced when considering that in most cases our voting pattern is along ethnic lines. So we have failed also in some way or the other to address the well, to find a solution to that governance problem. If we look, for example, at Suriname, they have managed somewhat to deal with that problem in the sense that almost every election kind of produce coalition governments, would give significant participation even to the minority groups within the society. I don't think we have seriously even begin to address that problem. And I think that is one of our post-independence failings. There are other failings that I think we failed to address after independence, but I leave that to my senior colleague to address.
Ralph, they've set it up nicely there for you.
Well, the question was, what did independence mean to me? You asked the panelists, what did independence mean to you? And I would like to return to the question of what did independence mean to me. Well, independence meant liberation, but liberation within a context. If you follow the history of the PPP was in office between 1957 and 1964, and then the PNC-UF coalition took office in 1964. Independence occurred in 1966. But if you follow the pattern of the 7 years that the PPP was in office, one of the main issues that confronted the government was the problem of economic development and the constraints which were placed on the government towards economic development. For example, they couldn't negotiate loans outside of outside of the traditional sources, like Great Britain gave aid, but the government was not free to negotiate loans and economic deals. You might remember, I don't know, all of you were young people, if or children at the time, we had a plan for the Tiger Hill, very modest electric, very modest hydroelectric power station. You couldn't get aid for that. So if you go back to 1963, when Teddy Jagan signed the Stans letter and agreed for the British government to impose, what was his explanation at that time? His explanation was that Guyana could not remain a colony any longer, that he could not envisage Guyana remaining a colony. Independence and urgent issue, an immediate issue. So independence meant liberation from the constraints of colonial rule that prevented Guyana from moving forward. That was what independence meant for me. For many years after, people used to say, especially since, our economy did not take off in any significant way, many people used to say, many people older than I was, used to say that it was better that we were with the British. It was a bad thing for the British to have left. Colonialism was better than independence. You don't hear that nowadays. But up to not too long ago, there were those voices. And it was always a great tragedy for people not to be able to, not to have been able to see beyond the, um, the constraints which colonialism had placed on Guyana. The removal of those constraints have not been all positive, but it did allow Guyana to chart its own course and to get the freedom to negotiate and to move forward. And that, for me, the liberation of Guyana from colonial constraints was the thing that most affected me in a very positive way at that time.
Um, Failures, Ralph?
Well, the failures that occurred post-independence was the failures of governance, was the failure to resolve. There were two problems that Guyana faced at the time. There was the political problem and there was the ethnic problem. The way in which the political problem was dealt with, the way in which the political problem was was, was treated with, um, exacerbated the ethnic problem. For example, in Trinidad, which is similarly constructed to us, a similar society, similar history, similar ethnic composition, of this roughly the same percentages and so on. Trinidad did not follow the same path as we did. So what aggravated the ethnic situation in Guyana as it did not in Trinidad was the political problem. The political problem was that Jagan was seen as a leftist, and the Americans did not want a government in Guyana that could potentially take Guyana the route of Cuba. The British had a different position. The British felt that Cherry Jagan and the PVP was an old-time nationalist political party with left orientation, which would have a self-correction, like many others. In Kenyatta was one, for example, to use one example, that there would have been a self-correction once the country got independence under Jagan, that there would have been a self-correction. Well, the Americans intervened in that situation and persuaded a reluctant British government. Ian MacLeod, who was a conservative, the Tory Secretary of State for the colonies, was very reluctant. And so was Macmillan. If you remember, the history tells us that Kennedy himself had to go to Macmillan, and he diverted a trip somewhere else. He went and he dropped into the UK, and he met Macmillan at Macmillan's country home somewhere. And so this was right. This had to happen. This happened right up at the highest level because the British were reluctant, and Kennedy persuaded, not persuaded, but I think he pressured Macmillan to agree. And so that political intervention by the Americans and to which the British joined is the factor that aggravated the the um, the political, the aggravated the ethnic problem in Guyana. We remember when Cherry put forward, after the pressure became very strong, there were the troubles in the 60s, and Cherry proposed a coalition government, sought the intervention of Eric Williams, sought the intervention of Nkrumah, there was a Ghanaian team and so on. Barnum rejected it because the deal was already done. And Barnum knew that he was going to get into office at some point in time, not too long after. And therefore, it was that interjection of the political problem that was responsible for the aggravation of the ethnic problem. Serious though it was, Rodney said at some point that having a united political party was not was not something that would have been expected. And having happened, it was not expected to be sustained. It was not sustained, but it did not. We did not develop like Trinidad. We developed differently, and the reason for that was the injection of the politics.
And Ralph Ramkaran there, he didn't use the word geopolitics. Geopolitics, race and ethnicity, and the governance, it seems to me that in 2022, we are facing the same thing that Ralph was talking about in the context of the 60s. We're going to take a short break. And my brother, Lincoln Lewis, is getting to talk to us a little bit about a project that he's part of. Lincoln, are you there? Lincoln Lewis? I don't think we're not seeing Lincoln on. We are not seeing Lincoln Lewis on. So we'll continue here with our discussion. Patty, I come back to you. Because I come to 2022.
Mm-hmm.
And as we look back, Ralph introduced the question of the economy. We talked about race and ethnicity. We talked about foreign policy. We talked about education. Ralph introduced the question of the economy. Here we are in 2022 with oil. We are an oil-producing economy. How does that change, or how does it potentially help to move the country from a dependent economy, post-independence, to a really independent country, an independent economy, an independent country?
David, potential is a word that, as a youngster, I used to say. In university days, I used to say that should be just taken out of a Guyanese dictionary, because for so many years we had talked about potential. I have grown up on this word potential, and I figure I'm going to retire with us not realizing the potential. So I mentioned that to say that the recent discoveries of oil has given us an awesome opportunity to change Guyana. The potential could be realized in terms of the access to the funds that we need to do so many of the infrastructure projects and things we couldn't do in the past just because of the cost of everything, finance. But from what I have seen take place in recent years, we're not going to make that transformation. We're not transforming Guyana. The few individuals, the minority in our society, the ones that hold the economic power, and unfortunately, we're getting very close to where Jamaica was in the mid 60s, when there was a frightening statistic that 10% of the population owned and had access to 60% of the country's resources and gross national product. And in Guyana's context, I think what we're doing now is that those that had a head start because of history, because of their businesses, they're the ones that are able to take advantage of the newfound opportunities. For the rest of the society, it's not touching them at all. And I think a classic example, I could say that was highlighted in the last budget presentation, when we actually gave close to $607 million was in US dollars was injected into the economy, into the budget. And as Dwayne has mentioned, free education, which is in our constitution, which we actually had. I grew up and benefited from free education. And so that hundreds of thousands of Guyanese over the years, the fact that we would not make a strong commitment and put some of those funds back in to making education free for Guyanese. And here, even if we didn't want to start off at, the university level at UG, we could at least have mandated that at all the technical institutes, more could be done to ensure that our local Guyanese and our young people could access the level of adequate training that required them to be able to participate in this new industry. And by that I mean very specifically, you talk about local content, but yet we have few young people that can go to a center that is well equipped. I'm not talking about a GTI that is still equipped insufficiently for the new trends in an oil and gas industry. I'm talking about injecting funds that could transform that institution and all the others in Berbice, in Linden, that would make it possible for any young Guyanese that is excited about oil to be able to go. It means paying their transportation to be able to go to GTI on the days they're going for the course. It means ensuring that they have maybe a little lunch stipend. It means ensuring that they have the little toolkit at the end of the day, that their fees are paid. That is a norm in most European countries and many other parts of the world. And the fact that we couldn't make that strong signal to show the commitment we were willing to make, not just the words, but the real commitment. And we spent close to 2 weeks arguing in the parliament, trying to work out exactly what projects those funds were going to go into. And as everybody knows, the record is there. There was very little clear indication on how the money is going to be spent. So the transformation will not take place. It's a small group of people that will be able to benefit. And the trickle down to ordinary Guyanese is absent. And unfortunately, it looks like maybe absent. I would like to be proved wrong.
Dwayne Benjamin, the coming of oil, will it enrich and deepen our independence, or will it retard our independence? I put it as frankly as that to you. We're not hearing you. We're not hearing.
Yes, I would say it's a frank question, but it's not a straightforward question as I think you would have envisaged.